uh, that's residential, and you go put, somebody wants to request light industrial, that the future land use map does not say it anticipates industrial in that area. So that would not be consistent with your future land use map. Uh, we've had this particular iteration of the future land use map since January of last year. Yes, ma'am. I can go back and I can, yeah.
Before, and then what land use changes.
That's a great question. I'll have that ready.
So
Yeah.
I don't know, would y'all be interested in that too?
Yeah, we can look at the different iterations and see. Frankly, I'm not sure how long we've had a future land use map. It's um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. No, ma'am. No, ma'am. Yeah. So, and I'll get into that a little bit here in a minute. Yeah, a future land use map. Again, to kind of quickly answer your question, they're not one and the same because a future land use map deals with general land use categories like retail, residential, commercial, industrial, and a zoning map deals with specific districts. Yeah, specific zoning districts created by our zoning code. I'll touch more on that in a minute. It's also important because it provides direction to developers and property owners. So when a developer goes to potentially buy a piece of land, it's important. I would hope that developers look at a city's future land use map. If they look at an area and they see residential, I would hope that they would consult that future land use map and maybe inquire on that if they plan for industrial uses. And so, that's an important indicator. That's basically the community's statement to anybody that owns property and is potentially looking to buy property to say, here's what the community imagines. If this is what you're wanting to do and it's not consistent with the future land use plan, you might run into some issues. And so that's kind of the basis for us upholding our zoning. I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Again, it also creates a framework for decision making that is in line with the community's vision. I live in the city of San Antonio, and I've got 3 kids, and I'm here right now, and I don't have time to go to the city council meetings in San Antonio and sit through that meeting. But I do know what the future land use map and the zoning map says in my area, so I'm confident that the decisions being made are consistent with that, so I don't have to go to every zoning commission meeting and make sure everybody's staying in line. So that's a big part of that public trust and community process. Again, what does the future land use map planning process look like? Well, it requires a lot of commitment and engagement from elected and appointed officials. We'll be doing that coming up here in the future. Again, the town hall meeting was a first step, and this is kind of a little bit more in-depth step into how the pieces. But it requires a lot of commitment, a lot of discussion. The future land use map community meeting. I've done several of them in my career. Usually, we'll be having a meeting at the community center probably, and there'll be a lot of storyboards around the room, and we'll be talking about this area, that area, different hypothetical scenarios for growth. And so we get feedback, and usually based on that feedback we get from the community, we go from there. So it takes commitment, engagement, and it usually involves identification. Looking at the land and looking at what the different capabilities of land are. You wouldn't want to allocate a industrial area next to floodplains. Maybe that probably is not a good compatibility there. Or allocate high density development in an area where the terrain is really rugged and hilly. So you definitely it involves engineering and careful balance of economics and whether looking at the ability to implement that future land use plan based on the existing land. And infrastructure. Identification of infrastructural issues. You wouldn't want to put a high-density development out in an area where, the nearest water and sewer line or roads are, 2 miles away. I'm speaking generally from any. Yes, sir.
I noticed that part there. Identification of existing uses desired to remain our transition. Could you give an example, maybe what that refers to?
I'll give you a perfect example. Say the community I just came from, Bulverde. A large part of their city was located on Highway 46. So you have quarries out there, which are pretty high impact areas. And so the city and their future land use plan had plans for Highway 46 to be more of a retail-oriented, retail and commercial-oriented corridor that, and they had a vision for the image of 46 as a gateway into the city. So in their future land use process, they decided, do we want these high-intensity industrial uses to stay, or do we want them to transition? And so that's the process of allocating that on a future land use map and saying, here's what it is now, and everybody talks about it, as that's a big deal when you decide, no, something is zoned this way or something is developed this way, but the sir.
Is there one, could you give an example in Leon Valley or?
Yeah, I think generally Bandera Road, probably. You know, we have a mix of commercial uses. We have a lot of automobile service uses on Bandera Road. You know, so I think there's a big difference between automotive, which is more commercial, versus, say, you know, a sandwich shop, which is more retail. You know, and so you have to look and see what's the vision. Do we want to?
Okay, just a clarification. I thought you said that the future land use map was updated in January of 2018. So we're going to redo it again? Is that what we're doing?
I'll look I don't know what the changes were that
Okay.
was made or whether that was.
Yeah, I'd like to see the before map and the after map, and then, you know, yeah, if you don't mind, I just wanted to clarify that. I thought that's what you said, and I just thought, well, why are we updating it again a year later?
The most recent copy that we have, the most recent map that we have, was most recently touched by the council last year.
Okay.
But in terms of any changes that were made on it,
Oh, yeah, okay. You're not sure of what changes were made when we adopted it in January of 2018. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, very good. Thank
I'll go
you.
back and look at that, and as we move forward with
Okay.
with the actual change process, I'll kind of show a
Wonderful.
hierarchy of that.
That would be great. Thank you.
Right, yeah, I wasn't here, so yeah.
Okay.
I wasn't here for the comprehensive planning process, so I wasn't a part of the
And again, the
development of it.
future land use map is under the comp plan.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
the zoning map is under the zoning. That's the distinction, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mr. Blackmore, here we go.
When was the first time they ever did this future land map thing here in Leon Valley?
We've had a comprehensive plan, I believe, since the 80s, so
Is that the first time? And how many times has it been revised since then?
I'll go back and find that out for you guys.
I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. That's a good question. I should have had that for tonight. But I do know, I think it had been a little while since we had gone and changed it. I think it had been it had been at least 15, 20 years since we had gone in and made any changes to our comprehensive master plan. So. And again, in addition to policies and goals and objectives and a comprehensive master plan, and you know, future land use policies, it always, you know, and when you're dealing with city planning and development, the most important element is the illustrative representation of the goals. So, you know, I'll go back to our future land use plan. There's two main approaches to a future land use map, and two main approaches to creating a future land use map. If you look at ours, you know, as I mentioned, it's pretty detailed. You know, you can see the parcel lines, lot lines. So the two main approaches are a specific map and a broad map. And so, you know, our future land use map is, you know, you can tell it's more of a specific type of map. It's not a bad way of doing it, and there is no bad way or good way. It's really how the city prefers to do it. You know, the communities the last community I came from, it was the same way. It was more of a specific map. And so, you know, that's it just depends on how detailed the community wants that map to be. It's nearly like a zoning map. You know, if you look at our zoning map, I'll go to that in a minute. It has a very high level of detail on it, and as we've discussed the past few weeks, you know, anytime a zoning change comes through that's not consistent with that future land use map, it requires a map amendment if a differing proposal is accepted or approved. There's also the approach, which is a more general, a more broad type of approach. It's designed a little bit more to be a little bit more conceptual, a little bit more flexible. However, there's a downside to that too. You know, the more that changes maybe aren't consistent with it, if it's right on the line, it may lead to diminished credibility and it doesn't hold any weight anymore. And of course, as we've talked about too, you know, being consistent in zone changes and equitable is very, very important. So, so this is a Pierce City. So you can see, you can compare to our future land use map. This one's definitely a lot more broad, a lot more conceptual. I will say, you know, typically the more broad conceptual maps are usually a little bit more oriented with communities that are looking to go more in a direction of mixed use. And you can see here, you know, the green area, that's generally intended to be a growth area. So this future land use map is really kind of doing a couple things. Number one, it's looking at future land use, but it's also allocating areas. Here's where growth is anticipated. So the green area is a green growth district. And they have industrial growth districts, business growth district, emerging growth area. You can see they have mixed use nodes, so they plan on these, you know, specific areas being a little bit more high density, being a little bit more mixed use. And of course, they look generally at floodplains and trails, and so I just wanted to show that because that's a good illustration of the difference between our specific formatted future land use plan and a more broadly formatted future land use plan. So now we've talked a little bit about comprehensive planning, future land use planning, and the different approaches that we'll be embarking upon here in the next couple months. And we've talked about planning. Now let's talk about how do we implement planning? What is the implementation of planning? Once we've already gone through the process, the community has gotten together, they've created this great master plan with this fantastic future land use map that spells the vision for the community and for growth and the type of growth. How do we implement this thing? There's really kind of like 5 main ways that we implement, and usually most of the implementation happens at a staff level, you know, because we're the ones receiving the development requests and we have to process them. We do that through subdivision regulations. You know, our city is mostly built out; it's mostly subdivided, so we don't do a lot of subdivisions. We do a lot more zoning in development review here, but we do occasionally get some subdivision plats. Some cities that are still growing, they implement their land use plan through annexation, like that map we just saw. They're still growing and they have growth areas, so they decide, hey, this is an area we want to grow, and boy, if we want this area to be developed in a manner consistent with the rest of the city, we better annex this, you know, before developers come in and they, you know, put in subdivisions out on the periphery that the city has no control over in terms of density and other things. Capital improvements, that's one way that a plan's implemented. You know, usually, roads lead to development. You know, development just doesn't happen in the field. It's usually because a road is extended or because a developer participates in the extension of a road to that area, and a city says, we want development to go here. So you put a road there, that's you're guiding that development. And of course, the 2 main things that we'll talk about here today, since some of these other, the first 3 are not as applicable to us, but zoning and development review are really the 2 primary areas where we implement a comprehensive plan on a day-to-day basis. That's the primary area. That's the basis of what I do and my great staff does every day. You know, reviewing for compliance with the zoning code and processing development. So what is zoning? Well, remember I said future land use planning is the what and the how. You know, what kind of general land uses do we want and where do we want them? Okay, zoning is the how. It's how are these land uses going to happen? And they're generally, zoning is generally organized into 3 primary functions: land use activities, and not the general ones that we saw on the future land use map. I mean specific ones, you know, where you have a use matrix that, you know, has dry cleaners, has, you know, barber shop, has a school, different things. And zoning has, you know, deals with performance standards. and I'll talk in more detail about those here in a minute. It has development and design standards. So you decide, okay, is this use allowed here, and how's it going to be developed? Some codes, depending on the city and the vision for that city, place more or less focus on these three things. It just depends. All zoning codes are different. And a lot of times that's a purpose of an overlay district, is to achieve one specific type of goal. It's like, okay, we want to apply this zoning overlay district here. The uses are generally fine, but we want to make sure they're developed a certain way. So you apply a zoning overlay that has additional standards. So in terms of land use activities, like I said, zoning deals with specific activities. I like that word better, like specific types of businesses. And it, in terms of land uses, one of the primary things is the establishment of zoning districts. That's our future land use map, and there's our zoning map. So you can see, as I mentioned, they're pretty similar. Pretty similar. A few. There's a few. And I'll get to that, because there will be some different, generally they're going to match. And that's part of the comprehensive planning process, and that's why it's so important, in terms of, when we consider zone changes, that those zoning actions are consistent. This is kind of, in terms of, I would say this is the fulcrum of the presentation and the fulcrum of the connection and relationship between comprehensive planning and future land use and zoning. It really comes down to this thing right here, in many ways. There's policy that we have where it says, the vision for Bandera Road is, say, retail or other things. But generally, all zoning codes, this is in our comprehensive plan, but in all zoning codes, you usually have what you call a land use zoning matrix. And so you can see here, if you go back to our future land use, we've got these general categories. So you can see those categories are here, land use category, and it gives a little description of some of the uses that you'd have there. And then it has the complementary, or the appropriate zoning districts. So what this is saying to me and to the zoning commission and to the council is that in an area that has this particular land use category, here are acceptable zoning districts. So that's the process that we use. Like I said, that's where the rubber meets the road. And so, yes. And I think there's a few on there. Yeah. Sorry. Right, exactly. Yeah. There's going to be a few, for instance, where we have a zoning commission item that the creation of the RE1 district. It's a single family district. So yeah, those are going to, we're going to have to come up and revise the zoning map to have a different color, maybe a little bit darker shade of yellow. So some of those differences, or maybe a difference between like, the R3 multifamily versus R3 multifamily retirement. Some of those areas, there may be some, I can go through and do analysis. So again, that goes back to the difference between a specific versus a broad map. In terms of that important relationship, so you can see the transition or the translation from future land use or land use classification to zoning, and then the rubber further meets the road when you get to, so now you've looked, so kind of like if you were decoding or coding this, you'd say, okay, what zoning district is allowed in the B2 retail? Okay, and so then yeah, that would be the basis for, what a potential zone change would be. And then when somebody buys the property and it's properly zoned, then they would come into our office and they would propose a specific type of activity. And so here are the specific activities: an animal clinic, antique store. And so you look and see, now this is the matrix for the actual activities in which zoning districts they're allowed in. So that's kind of how this process takes shape and occurs. And so we've had the SUPs for a long time. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And that, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Right. SUPs, you can look at SUPs kind of like, in a way, they accomplish a similar objective as an overlay district. And I think it's an SUP. I would consider an SUP a tool, kind of like you would. Some cities have planned development districts or PUDs. It's a tool to facilitate a specific development itself, and it can also be a tool to address maybe some other zoning map issues that you may have, or zoning code issues that you may have, short of just redoing the whole thing, which is, it's a comprehensive process. And so, so in terms of what is zoning, well, land use or activities, land use activities, that's a huge part of it in the zoning district. If you were to crack open our zoning code today, you'd see the first several pages are devoted to the establishment of the districts and generally what you can do. And then the further you get into it, then you get to that permitted use matrix I just showed you. And then the further you get into it, then you start getting into some of the standards, the performance standards. So what are performance standards? How's that different from land use? Well, performance standards deal with kind of more the impact that a development has, such as, what are typical impacts that a development has? Well, they generate traffic, they generate noise, some more than others, they generate lighting, maybe a little bit of glare, outside storage, that's a performance standard. Our B2 district does not allow for outside storage, but our industrial district does. May look at hours of operation. Floor area ratio is a biggie too. That's floor area ratio. As you know, that is the amount of, when you take the area of a piece of land, the square footage on a piece of land, and you look at what the square footage of the building itself is. Say there's 3 or 4 stories. So that's a way of kind of regulating the amount of density that you have on a piece of property. If you say the floor area ratio has to stay to 0.5, but then you're basically kind of saying you're limiting, the amount of stories that building could possibly go up and how much square footage it could be. So that's kind of we don't have that in our code, but there are a lot of zoning codes that have that. It's a way to regulate density. And I missed something in here. I didn't talk about what's in blue. So I don't want to get too academic on different types of zoning. We got into this at the zoning commission and we had fun on it. But and we can, if y'all have more questions about different types of zoning, but there are different names for different kinds of zoning. The most typical type of zoning that is throughout the United States, it's also one of the oldest kinds of zoning, is called Euclidean zoning. It gets its name from the famous court case. Like so many things, they get their names from a court case. It's called Euclidean zoning. It has nothing to do with geometry. Euclid was the city, and so what Euclidean zoning is it is primarily concerned with uses, and more specifically, it's concerned with isolating incompatible uses. And so what it says is single family over here, retail right here, office right here, industrial over here, and civic or parks right here. And none of it can mix together. Keep it all separate. And if you think about the way our cities are developed to a large extent, or at least the way they've been developed the last half of the 20th century, it's kind of like that. You've got the neighborhood right here, and if you want to go down here and get your groceries, boy, you better have a car. And no mixture. But then you go into older places that were developed before cars came around. You go to downtown Chicago, or maybe a little bit of San Antonio, but you go to some of our older cities, you've got the 4-story building with the apartments up here and the shops down here. You go to Brooklyn, and it's all mixed together. There's no isolation of uses. And so Euclidean zoning came about around the 20s when our cities were starting to grow. The Industrial Revolution was in its height, and in my profession, there's lots of benefits to mixed use, and we'll talk about that here in the future. But not all mixed use is good use. Sometimes there's some uses you don't want to mix. You don't want to mix a glue plant with an apartment building. So that's not good mixed use. Good mixed use is retail, office, being able to live where you work. and maybe not having to get on a car and create traffic. So that's Euclidean zoning. Our zoning code is more of a traditional zoning code. It's very Euclidean. But it's evolved over the years. You know, our zoning code has evolved, and we've introduced things over the years, such as SUPs and our overlay district and some performance standards. You know, we've got performance standards for non-chartered financial institutions and adult care facilities and different things. You flip through it. There's a section on how that's done. So there's some zoning that's specifically performance-based. They're not as worried about use. So again, those are some of the things that performance standards look at. Our zoning code has more or less has many of these things, and so that's basically the basis of, you know, more performance-based zoning. And then the third main area that zoning a zoning code addresses is development and design standards. So what is that? That deals with height, setbacks. So it says, you know, the building, you look in our zoning code, you know, I think it's 2.5 stories in a single family zoning district, so you can't build a 4-story Victorian house or anything. It has to be 2.5 stories. It says it must be set back, 25 feet from the street. That's intended to create consistency. Maybe it limits, some cities, their zoning codes limit impervious coverage because they may have to, you know, look at, you know, drainage issues. Look at landscaping, look at parking, where's the parking located. May look at architectural design. You know, our code, our zoning code, our general zoning code doesn't deal much with architecture, but our overlay district does. So what's architectural design? You know, looking at how facades design, how it looks from the street, materials that are used, maybe a little bit of ornamentation, cornices, string courses, all those fun things I love to talk about. And then there's kind of a new term that, you know, you'll probably hear more, and the term is gaining a lot more discussion throughout communities that are redeveloping, is urban design. And so really the difference between urban design and architectural design is really looking at what does the building look like? What are the features of the building? Urban design is focused with what is the building's relationship to the street? What is the building's relationship with other buildings? It's interested in the form of the building, not so much, you know, what style it is. There's a big difference between style and building type or form. And again, will the building be located up next to the street? That's a lot of this. We'll be talking about that because that's a big thing. Leon Valley is a very suburban community. It's very auto-oriented. And it was, a lot of it was developed in a time when things were more suburban in nature and very low density. Land was cheap, and it was easy just to put up a, you know, small building. You know, the more expensive land is, the more you need to get out of it, and the more you need to build on it to get your return. So that's a function of, if you drive down Bandera Road, you'll notice most of the buildings are set back. Most of them are 1 story, and you've got parking in front of it. Some areas a lot more parking than others. A lot of asphalt. And so that's something we'll be talking about. Is this a development pattern that this community anticipates keeping, or are we wanting to move in a different direction in certain areas or in general? So that's what in that discussion happens at a comprehensive planning level. That way, the zoning code implements that. The type of zoning that has been around, you know, has been developed about 20 years ago. The type of zoning that's more concerned with design and development and urban design, it's called form-based zoning. And so it's, like I said, it's less concerned with what happens on the property and more concerned with how the property is developed. It may acknowledge, okay, you know, an auto repair shop is okay right here, provided those big overhead doors are nice glass overhead doors that can be lifted up and they're transparent, not just metal. Because you know what? Today's auto repair shop downtown and off of St. Mary, or yesterday's auto repair shop on St. Mary's is today's Schwenke sandwich shop and cappuccino shop. So it's more concerned with looking there and saying, okay, this is maybe what we have right now. Here's what we want to build, and over time, these land uses will potentially come into place. And again, we've talked about overlay districts. We have 3 overlay districts here in our city. You know what is an overlay district? It's basically an additional zoning classification. It's just like the word says. It's applied on top of an already existing zoning. It's supplemental to a base zoning. In our zoning code in our city, we have retail, we have our B2 retail, we have our B3 commercial, we have our I1 industrial. And so any property that is in the overlay, it has those requirements, and it has the sustainability district or commercial and industrial district overlay requirements on top. So anybody develops, they need to look at both areas. What's required by B3 and what's required by the sustainability overlay district, supplemental. There's different approaches. Overlay districts aren't bad, and they're not, it's a different approach. And generally, it's a good solution when, like I said, a new zoning code is maybe not a feasible pursuit. You're having issues with a certain area, and you could go through a big process to redo the zoning code, or you could apply a zoning district to get that vision. Like I said, they usually focus on a certain area. I would say our sustainability overlay district is definitely a lot more focused on urban design. It's focused on land use to some extent, and it's definitely focused on initiating mixed use. But again, mixed use that's a complex subject. We're not going to talk about that today because there's very different kinds of mixed use as well. But like I said, we have three. We have our sustainability overlay, our commercial industrial overlay, and our gateway overlay, and they were generally created to initiate enhanced architecture and urban design, viable mixed-use development, economic development, and environmental stewardship. So again, if I could leave everybody with one key takeaway from the relationship between comprehensive planning and future land use planning and zoning, that key takeaway is zoning is not planning. It's implementation of planning. Okay, so I mentioned kind of the two main areas here in Leon Valley that how we implement our comprehensive plan. I mentioned zoning. That's the biggie. And there's also other areas. Like I said, subdivision improvements. We look at drainage, different things. I'll talk about that. We look at fire codes. That's super important. And we look at building codes as well. So in terms of subdivision improvements, what do we look at? We look at impact on city services. It's and when I say subdivision improvements, just because a property has already been subdivided doesn't mean we're still not looking at those improvements. Like the Timber Hill Apartments, they platted a couple of weeks ago, and we looked at water, sewer, we looked at drainage, we looked at traffic impact. We coordinated with the city to make sure the city, San Antonio, didn't need a traffic light. You look at all those types of things, and then when the project is so it's platted, and a lot of times those improvements don't really happen until the development happens when you come to get a building permit. And so we're always looking back. There's a relationship. You look at when you subdivide a piece of land, you usually subdivide a piece of land because you're anticipating development. Land is subdivided to prepare land for development. So you look at traffic impact. What's the impact on our water system? We have impact fees here in Leon Valley. So we looked at what's the impact on water and sewer provision. If something huge came in, like, would you need to add a new water treatment plant or a new wastewater treatment plant? You look at adequacy of infrastructure. Again, is a traffic light needed? You look at that at the time of subdivision. You look at that time of the building permit, and you always make sure all those things are consistent. You look at it at the time of zoning. We've talked about that quite a bit. Depending on which process comes first, the city needs that information. Another biggie is storm drainage improvements. Is how much water is draining off this site? Is that going to go into the street? Do we need to put in storm sewer, or are they going to keep all that water on site? We have to look at all those things, and if they're building, then look back to the plat. Did they put in enough infrastructure when they platted it to serve what they're proposing to build now? We also look at environmental here. Some places, the city I just came from, we implemented a bunch of environmental regulations that said you can't develop on hillsides, you can't mow down trees on hillsides, and limit impervious coverage, which is definitely a big factor in water quality. So you look at all those types of things. And typically, this function, much of this is done by the city engineer. Fire codes, that's huge. Chief Naughton's here. That's a big part of it. When we get a development in the door, usually you get the set of plans. You get the set of plans in, and kind of part of mine and Christina's job is to Christina Garcia's here. I should have introduced her. She's a planning technician. Big part of what we do. And so when we get a set of plans in, we route them out. I'm not an engineer, so we send the plans. We send a plan set that you get from from a developer. It usually has architectural plans. It has civil plans in it. It has fire plans, and usually has landscaping plans, electrical, mechanical, all that kind of stuff. So when the plans come in, they get routed off to our building official, Bruce Beeler and Associates. They get sent over to Chief and Fire Marshal Burnside. And so they review the main stuff you look at with fire code review. You look at fire suppression. All right, is there a fire hydrant there? Is there going to be enough fire flow to put out the fire? Is the fire hydrant within a certain amount of distance, or is the hose going to run out? And you also look at fire alarms, fire alarm systems, fire panels, all those types of things. And then from a site planning perspective, you have to look at fire apparatus access. Is the parking lot here? Is the improved surface for the fire truck here? And was the building way back here so they couldn't even get to it? And so you have to look at fire access, fire lanes, those types of things. So that's what we look at during fire code review. And then lastly, in development review, we look at building codes. And I left off the fact that we look at zoning too. I went into a lot of detail on that, but yeah, we do a zoning review, make sure is it compliant with the overlay district, has the right materials, all those types of things. But one of the final things that we do is we look at building codes. We send it off to Bruce Beeler, and he's our building official. He comes through the plans and reviews the submittal. Building codes usually consist of adopted codes. There's already the great codes out there that are used nationally. You've got the International Building Code, Residential Code, Electric Code, Energy Code. We usually just adopt those codes as they are. And the Fire Code, I left that one off, the International Fire Code. So you look in our building code, we have, in our code, we have what we call a building code. It's Chapter 3. You can look at it online. And it, first several chapters, it says, this edition of the Building Code 2017 is hereby adopted. NEC is hereby adopted. And then most cities usually supplement their building codes with additional codes. Sometimes the fire chief will have additional regulations, that are more strict, or some cities may have fire regulations that are a little bit more lenient. You only need one access route out of a subdivision instead of two. So they usually supplement in a certain way. Our code has supplemented building codes as well. We have a flood damage prevention ordinance that deals with our floodplain and structures in the floodplain. A lot of cities have tree preservation in their building code. I think ours was in there, and then we pulled it out. Now it's its own chapter. And in building codes, a lot of times signage is in the building code. Some cities, they put signage in the zoning code. It just depends on how the city wants to handle that. Big difference there, between putting something in the building code versus in the zoning code is, if people want relief from it, if it's in the zoning code, they're going to the Board of Adjustment, which is very strict. Definitely there's specific criteria there in all cities, and we're talking about that too. But if it's in the building code, everything else, any other types of variances or relief, that goes to the city council. So again, our building code is supplemented with flood damage prevention, signage, tree preservation, and also fencing. Fencing is definitely an important topic in terms of, it kind of goes both ways. In some cases, people want fences. In other cases, maybe fences are necessary to buffer different uses. And fencing is critical depending on, what area you're in and size of lots, those types of things. So yeah, that's generally the main area. So again, just to summarize, again, like I said, there's a very clear difference between planning and the implementation of planning. Planning is the comprehensive plan. Planning is the future land use plan, dealing at a high level, general level, and implementation of planning. Zoning is the implementation of planning, in addition to development review, implementation of building codes, and reviewing individual projects. So with that generally concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Michelle Pena, and I belong to the Lutheran Church of the Resurrection. I was just curious about where you would zone, what zone a church would be in. Is that
That is a great question.
okay?
And so right now, churches are permitted use in the B3 commercial zoning district, so everything in green.
Okay.
Churches are allowed use in the light industrial district, so in brown. And churches also are permitted use in the R3 district, so which is the orange areas. Churches are also allowed in the R3A, which is the light green area. They're allowed in the R4, which we don't have. We have a little bit of right there. And I think that's generally, yeah, that's the zoning district. Yeah, maybe that is. Yeah, I think that is. I don't think that's mobile home. On the map, yeah, okay, there you go. So we have those two. And again, any place on a zoning map where R3, R3A, R4, or R5, anywhere where that's created, churches would also be allowed in those zoning districts as well, as well as any institutional use. Yes, ma'am.
So they're allowed in any district except what?
Well, churches or in other institutional uses are only allowed in the B3, the I1, R3, R3A, R4, and R5. So the districts that they're not allowed in are the B1, B2, I1. I'm sorry, O1. That's what I'm going to say. O1, R1, and R2, and R6 and R7.
Okay, so our church is right now in a B2, which it wasn't before. It was rezoned as a B2, and we're just trying to figure out why that rezoning for a church because it was government exempt before, and then it was rezoned to
Down
B2.
here, right? Right there?
Yeah. And we were just wondering if there was a process to change the zoning or ask for a variance.
Can't get a variance. I'm sorry.
You can't?
I thought you were Yeah, you can, state law doesn't allow you to get a variance for use, but it does allow you to get a zone change. I mean, you can always, always request a zone change. It just, again, as we've talked about, as you consider it, as a zoning commission, city council considers zone changes, we always have to look back to the future land use map to see if it's compatible. And if it's not compatible, then you also the council has to consider a future land use plan amendment before they can approve that zone change. Yes, sir.
Can you confirm whether or not there was a zoning district called office or civic, or was that a land use classification? Paul Fletcher, 745 East Mulberry.
You say office or?
She just mentioned that she thought her church was rezoned from civic government. If you go to the land use map, the future land use map, there was an older map in the plan that talked about government exempt.
Yeah.
And so the question is that a land use classification or was that a zoning classification?
So I wasn't
You know.
here. Sorry.
I just said if you know.
So I wasn't here when the previous zoning map was in place, and I wasn't here. And you know, the Church of the Resurrection, they've reached out, and we've talked a couple times, and y'all brought that map to me too. And so that, you know, when I saw that map, I was like, okay, so we used to have a district like this, and so I've reached out to my predecessor, and she said that I think somewhere along the lines, to her knowledge, there wasn't an actual civic district that existed. There was a map that was created to show the different civic properties, and so I'm looking into that for everybody, just to get the specific. Generally, what I'm doing is looking at all the different zoning maps that we've had, and I'll provide that background, that complete evolution of our zoning maps.
Just one more question. If the land use plan is the planning tool for zoning districts, what do you do when the land use plan or the comprehensive plan do not address particular uses or categories of uses, such as institutions?
Well, again, as we've talked about in the past, that's when you look to the policy of the plan. What does the comprehensive master plan say? You know, does it say, in the case of Bandera Road, or in the case of, you know, retail areas, it'll say the vision for this area is for it to be retail. So there may be situations where a comprehensive master plan or a future land use plan isn't going to address every single land use. As I mentioned, the purpose of a future land use plan is to be general. And so if it doesn't address that, then you look to the policy and you look to interpret what is the general goal for this area. Is this particular land use in question compatible with the other uses? Take for instance a church or an institution. I think that was the purpose of changing the code to allow for institutions in the R3, the R4, and the R5 zoning districts, is because it's generally understood that churches are a compatible use with neighborhoods. We go to church every day. Why relegate a church specifically to a commercial or industrial area? So, that's where you look at your comprehensive plan and you look at the goals of the comprehensive plan, and then you take your zoning code, and then again. And the zoning code has zoning districts, and you look at what does the zoning district say the purpose of this district is. I guess I hope that answers your question. A future land use plan can't anticipate every single land use. A future land use plan isn't going to say hookah lounges should be over here. No, that's generally going to be a retail or a tobacco or similar related use. So you look at that. A lot of it has to do with interpretation.
Land use categories are institutions in? Institutions retail? Are they commercial? You told us they can go in residential areas. You told us they can go in industrial areas. You told us institutions can go in commercial areas. So are institutions fall within all three of those categories?
I would say, again, you have to look at the policy of the master plan. The future land use map is not going to have every single use on it. It's not going to have mixed use. It's not going to have, duplexes or any of those types of things. It may have two-family, and two-family can mean a few different things. So it's not going to have every single land use on it. So again, you have to look at, that's when you get into the interpretation of the zoning matrix. Here, let's go back and look at this here. So typically, I think something that we'll be looking at as we go forward and look at revisions to our future land use plan and look at this land use map, we can dig into more detail there on what uses, and looking at the policy and objectives of, this particular land use classification. You look at single family residential, or you look at, multifamily residential. And so it would be defined as multifamily residential and compatible uses, such as neighborhood service types of uses, or institutional types of uses that serve those neighborhoods. And I think that's, to answer your question, that's the process that we went through when we changed the zoning code to allow for institutions in the R3, the R3A, the R4, and the R5 district, because we used the comprehensive plan and we determined that a church is a compatible use with those districts. And it's also compatible and pursuant to the other goals of the master plan, which include promoting retail and promoting economic development, and promoting economic development on Bandera Road. So the plan does not specifically say that institutional uses are, say, compatible on a primary economic corridor, but it says, these uses are compatible with surrounding neighborhoods. So that's why we made the code pursuant to that objective of the code. So it didn't specifically address it, but it gave guidance for how to handle specific activities, as I discussed in zoning. Zoning is specific activities, future land use is general.
For instance, churches are allowed in commercial, and commercial is a land use category, and those are available in office districts, B1 districts.
Excuse me, can we use the mic, please?
Since churches are allowed in commercial districts, 2 commercial districts, correct? And they fall within...
No, that's not correct. Churches are allowed in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different districts.
Churches are allowed in B3
I-1,
and I-1.
and R3, and R3A, and R4, and R5.
Under the land use category, commercial, that includes 3 other zoning districts: office, B1, B2, and B3. So since a church is allowed in commercial, wouldn't it fall within that land use category
No.
as commercial?
No, you've got it backwards. No, so what this is saying is, on this map, in the areas that are green, the possible zoning districts that this zoning commission and the council could approve within the green are O1, B1, B2, and B3. The future land use map is giving you direction towards the future zoning districts. It's not saying these specific zoning districts for this, or these specific land use. It's just saying, here's your menu of options.
Maybe not. Let me restate the question. Institutions are allowed in B3.
Right.
Under your zoning districts, B3 uses only permit certain land use categories. 2, and those land use categories are commercial and light industrial. Do we agree with that?
I don't know where you're going with this.
Do you agree that churches are allowed in B3?
Yes,
That's undisputed.
they're allowed in B3.
The only type of land use categories allowed in B3 under your zoning matrix here is commercial and light industrial. So my question is, since a church is allowed in B3, wouldn't institutions are allowed in B3, by your own chart, they are commercial land use categories and light industrial categories. They can also be single-family categories and the R1s too.
So what you're saying is, you're saying that because a church is allowed in B3, you think it also ought to be allowed in a B2 and a B1 and an O1. You're saying that since you consider a church compatible with commercial, you should consider it in these other zoning districts.
I'm trying to follow your chart. You indicate land use plan, you look at land use categories. And then from those categories, you implement them in districts. You've implemented institutions in B3 districts. So when I look at B3 under zoning districts, I only see 2 types of land use categories: commercial and light industrial. So by allowing churches in B3, or institutions, let me rephrase, that means they are, by definition, a land use category that's compatible with commercial or light industrial.
I think that's tenuous. I think you're building
So-
a narrative there that is really not what anybody said.
We need to make sure that we pass the mic to everybody that would like to get a chance to say something. We do have to adjourn this meeting at 8 p.m. or before, a little bit before 8 p.m. because we have a special city council meeting. Oh, you want him? Okay. Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. I just wanted to.
Thank you, David. I think what we're trying to understand from this table is that when you look at the future map, if it's green, we can change it from the green to an O1, a B1, a B2, or a B3 if it's green. We cannot change an R1 into a B3. We can't,
Right.
according to the future land use map.
That's great. And I just want to point something else out because that got a little confusing. You look up here at these zoning districts, R1 to R6 to R7. What you're looking at is a range of intensity. You're moving from lowest intensity to higher intensity. So in terms of that example, auto repair and used car lots are allowed in a B3. Does that mean that they're compatible in the O1 district? Or does that mean they're compatible in B1, which is our retail? So there's lots of different, it's not a matter of just because something is allowed in a B3, that means it's compatible with, it's a commercial and it should be allowed in all those districts. That's where, it's the job of the zoning code to continue implementing this and determining what's the vision for this zoning district. What are the different uses within this zoning district? Are they retail-oriented, service-oriented, compatible uses of these types of zoning? So that's really the purpose. This is a menu. This is just saying within this classification, these zoning districts are allowed. That makes sense.
The other thing I want to point out is, and this kind of goes to your point that you were asking about rezoning and everything. Zoning, and this kind of goes for everything, not just institutional uses. Zoning changes. So if it changed, as long as your facility was properly zoned at the time it was built, it's grandfathered in, even if the change has happened. So you don't have to change your zoning for it unless you plan to build or expand or hit that threshold for where that would happen. And I think that's been a lot of confusion lately as well. The vast majority of places, we'll go back to the institutional because we all know that's where this is going. Institutional uses, a lot of them are in B2. They are perfectly fine and acceptable in those B2 places because at the time they were built, that was acceptable and permitted in the zoning code. Now, if they wanted to change or move or, double their size, then that would be a whole different ballgame. So, and that goes for really anything. So, I just want to make sure that's clear on the table. You may be non-conforming, but that doesn't mean you have to fix it right now. Only if you want to do a massive change.
Okay. Yes.
I wanted a clarification on, at some point, I thought I read and that you said the future land use under the master plan is the legal basis. We cannot change things legally from our master plan to something else. Can you explain that again, please?
Yes, ma'am. I'll go back to it. There we go. So yeah, compliance with the comprehensive master plan. So it says zoning regulations must be adopted in concordance with a comprehensive plan and must be designed to address those issues. So again, starting with the future land use map, which says, and that matrix that we had up there that we were talking about, it says within these land use classifications, these particular zoning districts are permitted. So if you have a land use classification, almost there, hold that thought. If you have a 2-family dwelling, which allows you to have these zoning districts, but you came in and requested a B3 zoning district, or if you had a single family R1 and you requested a B3, not only would that zone change, that change not be consistent with the future land use plan, you would be adopting regulations and applying zoning regulations to that piece of property that are not consistent with the zoning regulations and allowed uses and development standards and performance standards that we talked about. Those would not be compatible with what your future land use plan says is envisioned for that piece of property. So that's why that section of the code is so important, because zoning regulations are applied through the application of a zoning district.
So the answer is no, we cannot do it.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
That's
and then
right.
the second thing, going back to a previous question where they were talking about government exempt, I had an understanding that government exempt meant government, for example, the post office or a public school. They had, don't they have some exemptions? And can you explain that, please?
Yes, ma'am. They do have exemptions, and that's I think what those maps that we were talking about earlier that have government exempt illustrated on it that a few of the churches have seen, and raise the question about yes.
But
Those maps.
church is not a government.
No, right.
Okay, so that comparison is not equated.
Right. So the state law says that that state facilities, state entities, and federal entities are exempt from zoning regulations. So school districts derive their power from the state, so that means they're exempt. And in any kind of in federal facilities such as post office, they're exempt as well, provided they own the land. If they, say if If a post office leases the land, then they're not exempt if a private property owns it. And so yes, many of those, several institutional uses are exempt from zoning requirements. John Marshall High School is exempt.
Okay, I think you need to talk into the mic.
Yeah, thanks. That answers your question.
Okay, yes.
Sir.
So what is the zoning classification for the SAWS facility at Wurzbach and Evers, this facility here, and the post office, and the schools?
Let's go back.
Oz is outside of our district. Okay.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, Saws is in the city limits.
Oh, yes.
The city of San Antonio.
Yeah, Saws is not in our district.
So weird.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah.
I wish you could blow that up.
Jogs
You know,
down.
really, that needs to be blown up.
I have a question for Paul. I've already asked a lot of questions.
Mr. Milano, this one, make sure I understand what you said earlier about the future land use map is created by the citizens, the elected officials, the staff, and so forth, is what the future of that particular piece of property or the city is to be in the future, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so when the question was asked about the different categories of properties, it was completely impossible to change or for development to go in that particular piece of property. You said that was correct. So, not saying I'm trying to change any particular piece of property, but if the future land use map is designed for the citizens' input, the elected officials, so forth and so on, for what they see for the future of any particular piece of property, then I don't think that was the correct answer, as if it's impossible to not be changed. Did I misunderstand that?
No, sir. Thanks for asking that question. So it's not possible for the zoning commission or it's not possible for the city council to make a zoning action and change the classification on a property unless it's consistent with the future land use map. And so if the council were inclined or the zoning commission were inclined to approve a zone change that wasn't consistent with the future land use map, the future land use map would have to be amended before they make the zoning discussion. So that's why, you know, we've done that. We've been talking about that with a zoning change item that, you know, with the St. John's Baptist Church zone change item. Every time we have that discussion, we have to discuss amending the future land use plan first. So it's important that, again, the you know, dog wags the tail, and so that the future land use map has to be amended in order to take that action, and that happens during a public hearing, and it's amended through an ordinance, and through the same process that, you know, generally goes into, you know, the comprehensive plan. You know, any changes to a comprehensive plan are adopted through an ordinance and through a public hearing where citizens have the ability to come out. It's noticed on our agenda. It's the way the citizens know, okay, we're potentially going to change the vision of the community here. Come on out. If you have an issue with applying B3 or applying commercial in this area, come on out and let us know. And y'all have they have the ability to have a voice in that. And if the council and, you know, decides not to amend the future land use plan, then you've basically made your voice and taken your action on not approving that zone change too.
Okay.
So it can be amended. It's not impossible. It's just there's a process to do it. You can't just change the zoning code without amending the future land use map.
So, I mean, is it fair to say that we used to allow churches in B2, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
So, I guess, because I remember in 2005, the Church of Latter-day Saints went in on Hebner Road, and that's B2. So sometime after that, the future land map was changed?
No, ma'am. The future
Okay,
land
so-
use map was not changed. So the zoning code was changed.
Okay, the zoning code is, so can you give us a history? And not tonight, I know you and I talked about that
Absolutely.
today, but you said you would provide that,
Yes,
just
ma'am.
to kind of how we went from this point to this point and how we got to where we are today.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, any other questions, comments?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so now, since our church is now in a we're non-conforming because we're in a B2, is there a period of time in which we have to conform, or you said we can stay the same, or can our church add retail? I'm just confused about that whole thing.
Yes, ma'am. So there's, when a church is, when any use that's not permitted within the zoning district that it currently exists, it means it's lawfully existing, and the term is legally non-conforming, which means you can continue to operate as you currently operate right now, and there isn't any requirement for you to come into conformance. In some cases, if you're, when you deal with like say a development, you're allowed to have the use, but it's developed in a way that's not in conformance, like say it's an old building that has all metal on it or something. We run into this a lot with the Sustainability Overlay District. The use is allowed, but it's not developed in a way that's consistent with the development standards. Then you have to make some changes if you want to expand. But if you're just existing and you don't have immediate plans to expand, there's no need to come into conformance. You're fine the way you are.
Until it burns down.
Oh.
Here, why don't
you
have
I don't know
if you
about
have a
that.
disaster of some sort,
Yeah.
you can't rebuild.
And I think you bring up a great question, and I think that's something we've talked about. Yes, ma'am.
For her record, could we get the name and address, please?
An address?
Yes, please.
My name is Joyce Swartz, and I'm with the LCR, Lutheran Church of the Resurrection.
Ma'am, thank you. I think in situations like this, especially with the St. John's Baptist Church, it's always important to look at a situation and say, what is the immediate task at hand, and what is the larger task at hand? So I think in this case, we have St. John's Baptist Church that plans to expand now. They have development applications in the door, and they plan to expand now. And the council has that request before them. So that's the immediate task. How do we address this situation right here? And then we have another situation, which is we have many other churches throughout the city that are not properly zoned, are legally non-conforming, and may desire to expand in the future. So how can we address that situation too? So they're two different issues. And in any planning situation, this or any other similar situation, it's important to make sure that you look at both situations and come up with good solutions. So I think that's what we're doing. We've gone through a process for churches where we said, look, St. John's Baptist Church is located at Huebner and Evers Road, and it's surrounded by residential. Right now, or a couple months ago, the only zoning district they were allowed to operate in was the B3 and the I1 district. Those are obviously not appropriate compatible zoning districts for that area. The future land use plan doesn't say B3 or I1 is appropriate for that area. So how else can we address that? Well, we determined through looking at our comprehensive plan and analyzing the surrounding areas that definitely a church it can be a compatible use with that area. Is a B3 zoning district? No. And so then we looked at changing the code. How else can we address this situation? So we took a comprehensive planning approach and analysis of that and said, how else can we address this? Well, we can amend our zoning code to allow for institutions in other zoning districts that actually would be compatible in that area. And we did that, and so we changed the code, and the St. John's Baptist Church could request an R3, an R3A, an R4, or an R5 district. So they have options available right now that could facilitate a church, which is what they're wanting to do. And so that's an example of taking a comprehensive planning approach to solve a problem. And I think, now they're located here away from the Bandera Road, but we also have your church that's located here, and we have other churches located throughout the city. So it's important. Okay, we addressed this issue and provided a feasible avenue forward. how do we address these others? So I think, and that's what we're going to continue to do. We started that dialogue at the council meeting last time where we started talking about a civic district and other potential solutions. We'll be talking about that tomorrow night. So it's very important to say, okay, we have an immediate issue with an application before us that someone that wants to expand now. That is a short-term issue. That's near-term. How do we address all these other issues, or how do we address the other institutional uses from a long-range planning perspective that have different variables, different surrounding uses, in a different areas where our comp plan has a different vision for that area. So it's important to separate these situations out. But I'm sure that we're going to take the same approach to come up with a solution.
Would you pass that to Hillary, please?
I'd like clarification about the specific issue of a non-conforming property having a major disaster, like if the building burned down. Would you please clarify, in that case, would they have to rezone before rebuilding?
Yes, ma'am. So right now, if a use is non-conforming, thank you, Denise. Appreciate it. So if a use that's legally non-conforming is damaged less than 50%, so I'll read it. It says, nothing in this article shall prevent the restoration of a building that is destroyed by fire, explosion, or other casualty of God or a public enemy by less than 50% of the appraised value of the building. So basically, if there's less than 50% damage, they can add that back. And so, but if it's more than 50%, then it can't be added. So to answer your question, yes, if it's more than 50%, and if that institution wishes to rebuild back to the 100%, they would have to request a zone change in order to be able to accomplish that. A zone change to a zoning district that allowed for their use.
Brandon, I have a question for you.
Sure.
The future land use for the frontage property of the Baptist Church is retail. Now, we've talked about not being able to do certain things. You can't convert from one form to another. What are the possible changes that the R2 can convert to? The B2, sorry. B2, what can it be, based off of our future land use map, what can it be turned into? Or do we have to, regardless of the situation, change our future land use map?
Okay, that's a good question. Let's go back to that. Can we go back to there you go. Okay. So right now, the front portion of that property has a retail land use classification. So the possible options right now, as it's classified on the future land use plan, are O1, B1, and B2. So right now, the zoning is consistent with the future land use map. So say if that property, if the church wanted to request an R4 zoning, and we changed the code to allow for institutions and churches in the R4 zoning. Say if they wanted to request an R4 zoning, then we would still have to do a future land use map amendment in order to facilitate that. And at that time, we'd have a community discussion, the same way we had before, and we're going to have again, and say, okay, what type of land use classification needs to happen needs to happen in order for R4. And so we would decide as a group, be like, okay, do we think townhomes, and the council, zoning commission and council would need to decide, let me go back to the future land use map here. There we go. Our townhouses, that blue, we've got a little blue here right next to R1 down here. It's a transition, it's right next to B2. Look at that. B2, R4, R1. B2, R4, R1, and then R6. So you'd say, do we think R4 is a compatible land use classification with B2 and R6, which is our small lot housing, and R1? And so that would be the discussion that would be had. And if the zoning commission and the council said yes, we think that townhouse is compatible, then the future land use map would potentially be amended. First action, and in the zone change to R4 townhouse would be the next action. That way, your zone change is consistent at that point. It may be a matter of 5 to 10 minutes, but your zone change would be consistent with your future land use map. it depends on what is requested by the property owner. It could be just for the back piece or the whole thing.
Okay. I was just thinking about the Lutheran Church because they're B2, and you said they can't, if they have a disaster that's 50% or more, they can't rebuild. Do they lose that B2 zoning though?
They would not lose the zoning. They would just lose the ability to continue
Okay.
operating that
All
use
right.
within
Now,
the B2.
What if, and I think y'all have got a pretty big lot, and so they've got the church. What if they had space to add B2 retail on their church right now? Could they do that?
They could, absolutely.
Okay.
And if they left it the way it was, like say they just developed the back, they wanted to develop the back portion, they could do that R4. If they wanted to change and
All right.
move the B2 up a little bit, reduce that portion, that could happen as well. And leave the front part, retail or B2. Absolutely. There's definitely a lot of options. Yes.
Yeah,
Talking
she's
about the Lutheran property.
I was talking about the Lutheran.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of follow back.
Yeah.
I just wanted to follow back
yeah.
up. I thought that's what she had said. Thank you.
But yes, they wouldn't lose their zoning classification. It's just lose the ability to continue using the use unless some other zoning district were applied for.
Is the procedure the same for changing the R1 to an R4 as it is for changing the B2 to an R4?
Can you say that one more time? I'm sorry.
Is,
I was thinking I got the zoning.
would the procedure for changing R1 to R4 be the same as changing B2 to R4?
Yes, ma'am. It would, because if you were to change, it's that property is zoned. This portion of their property is zoned R1, and in order to change it to R4, you would need to change the land use classification to townhouse, and same with the front portion. If you wanted to apply an R4 on the portion that's zoned B2, well, right now the future land use map says that's B2 retail, and anytime you have an area that's retail and you're looking at not making it retail, you have to think about the economic aspect of things, and business is important for areas, so that would be a change too. That would require a future land use map amendment as well. Both the scenarios you described require the same process.
It seems to me that what you're saying is a little different. That the consideration of the B2 to R4 is more detrimental than R1 to R4.
I understand what you're saying. I thought you meant in terms of the legislative process. I'm sorry. In terms of the analysis, R1 to R4, you have to look at the details. R1 to R4 means a little bit more density. I could look at the lot size. It just basically allows for a little bit smaller lot and allows for the structures to be connected. And so I can provide more info and a breakdown of maybe how many units per acre are currently allowed on R1 versus how many units per acre would be allowed on R4. And so you'd look at that. You'd look at the density. How many more cars is it going to be? I don't think it'd be a lot, but there would be a change. And then, say, taking something from B2 to R4, you're taking a retail use which has, barber shops and restaurants maybe. You're taking that to an R4 townhouse. That would be a substantial reduction in the amount of impact, like we were talking about earlier, in terms of performance and impact. Much less reduction. And in terms of the Resurrection Church too, again, in terms of all the churches, it's important to kind of, I think through a thorough planning approach, looking at all of the churches, saying, what's the potential solution here? What's maybe the solution here? Would an R3 work here versus a B3 work here? Maybe a hypothetical new district work here? Again, it's kind of important they're all different, totally different areas, totally different situations, and it takes kind of a planning approach to see, do we have the palette of menu of zoning options in place to address all of these different non-conforming institutions?
I know we talked today, and did you find out what the minimum lot requirement is for B2 development?
The minimum lot depth? I believe it's, Denise, can we look at that?
Yeah, I just was curious on that because that might be possible.
Can have that for just a minute.
Lot is
Minimum lot depth.
9,000 square feet.
30 feet, Mayor.
9,000 square feet, 100 and,
The
what's
depth
it?
is 130.
The depth is 130, okay, and 9,000 square feet is the minimum. Is that right?
That's
Of
like
B2.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I've been curious about that. All right. Anyone else?
What was the thinking, splitting it so finely that if a church is burned down, splitting it like that, 51%, 49%, if it's an act of God, and we're, so to speak, and, we're saying a church can't rebuild, unless it's split that way?
But I'd say if I can,
Anything.
yeah.
Anything. Any non-conformance, not just churches.
But isn't the act of God different than the actual burning down?
I think any destruction.
It's all the same.
Cause to the structure.
I always go back to my, concrete batch plant example, not to pick on concrete, we need concrete, but, if you have a industrial area, it's really intense, and you anticipate that changing, that's it, like Mr. Smith pointed out, it applies to everything. And that's having a regulation in your code like that is very important, because without something like that, it just allows a use to keep on expanding and say, and this isn't about institutions or churches, it's just about making sure your code has the tools to implement your future land use plan. And if there's an existing area and the city has a vision for that area to transition, without a regulation like that, it's going to make it really difficult to happen if it's already existing. So it's important to not take the meat and the strength out of your code just to address one situation, but look at that situation from a planning perspective and say, and that's the point of the future land use process, like I pointed out. You look at things that are existing, do you want those things to remain or not? And then you apply that future land use classification, apply zoning.
But just to clarify my understanding, when the church was built, it was okay. The zoning was okay, and then it was changed. So they were zoned into a non-complying status?
That's correct.
That seems a little non-conforming.
Yeah.
I wasn't here for that, so
yeah.
Well, that's that history that I
yeah,
don't
that's right.
Yeah. Yes.
Dr. Edwards, everybody. From what we understand is that when the Elijah case, Elijah versus City of Leon Valley, before that the churches were zoned practically probably everywhere in Leon Valley. And the institutions, other institutions, were not treated the same. And so when the Elijah case happened, the City of Leon Valley decided to just lump all of the institutional uses, including the churches, into one category, into one zoning district, and that was B3 to solve the problem.
And I-1 too.
And what?
And I-1 as well.
And I-1. So now this is the situation we're in, and since then you've changed the zoning for institutional uses to include R3, R4, R5, and
that's it. And
that's
R3A.
it. And R3A. So that's the short history.
What year was that?
2009.
2009.
And again, if I just to confirm again, in terms of churches and institutions and addressing that issue, you've got R4, which is permitted, may be a good fit in certain places. R3 may be a good fit. The Resurrection Church is right next to R3, so that's well, it's next to B3, but it's also next to R3. R3 as multifamily is definitely something that could be considered compatible with retail uses. People that live in multifamily situations need places to shop, so that's an option. So again, like I go back, it's just important to look and take each one of these on a case-by-case basis, and come up with the best solution so everybody feels like, okay, our needs are being addressed. But making sure that it's whatever the solutions are, is also pursuant to the comprehensive plan and the vision of the community as a whole. Changes aren't being made, brashly that would have repercussions throughout the city. Changes to one zoning district. So hope that helps. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Sorry. Can you explain the Elijah? It seems to be before our time for a lot of people here, and
Sure.
this is what is the basis for what's going on now. Is that correct?
It's not the
Kinda.
basis for what's going on now, but it's definitely historical
Influenced it.
context.
Thank you.
So as we discussed, churches and other institutions used to be allowed in all zoning districts, and that was changed prior to the Elijah case. And so in the Elijah case, the church was wishing to locate in Leon Valley. And correct me if I get anything wrong on this, Denise, but so they weren't allowed to occupy, and so they challenged the fact that they weren't able to locate in the B2 zoning district, and that was potentially. Yep.
Well, I'm sorry, Brandon. I think that what happened is that they were trying to locate in an area where another institutional use was allowed by right, and the court determined that the church is an institutional use just as the other institutional uses are, and you can't discriminate against churches where you let some institutional uses be in some zoning districts and not churches, and vice versa. They all have to be treated equally and the same. So the city of Leon Valley decided at that point, when we lost that case, I wasn't here, but when we lost that case, they decided to solve the problem by putting all institutional uses in B3. And because of St. John's, we wanted to give them more latitude, and instead of just being in B3, give them other options of rezoning the area where they are, because they are a non-conforming use and they would like to expand. So that's what this issue arose about.
Did I hear you correctly that you're looking at St. John's and you're looking at the churches individually in terms of trying to resolve the non-conforming status and their desire to be able to persevere if they were to have some type of disaster or would wish to expand?
So we have a dual situation here. I think in terms of like how we look at this from a planning standpoint. We have the question of how do we want to treat our existing churches, and then we have a different question, which is how do we want, not churches. The dual question is how do we want to address existing institutional uses, including churches, and then how do we want to address future institutional uses, not here yet. So those are the two big questions I think to ask. And again, I think it's important to look at this from a planning standpoint and ask these different questions. How do we want to treat the ones that are here, have been here? How do we want to treat their potential expansion? And what are the different options available to them right now? And so that's a different question than saying, do we want institutional uses in churches throughout the city? Where do we want them? That's a different question. So in terms of what your question is, Mr. Fletcher, it's two questions. How do we address the ones that are here? Do we have the tools that we need to address them right now? Do we need to introduce new tools? Do we want them to expand? Those are questions for the Zoning Commission and Council. And do we want to address those on a case-by-case basis and take care of what we have now? Or do we want to allow for more institutional uses throughout the city? And it goes back to what I said with future land use planning. The what and the where versus, with zoning is the how. So how do we want to treat what's here now, and how do we want to treat future churches and institutions that don't exist? Let's not lump them all together. Two separate questions.
But the the use or the institutional use, we all are considering the B2 and allowing institutions in the B2 zoning district. Y'all are considering that globally. How do we treat churches as a whole or institutions as a whole?
Exactly.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's
Because I
the
thought I
second
heard you
question.
explain, for this church you can rezone here, for this church you can rezone there.
Yeah.
But I think the question that I think that needs to be resolved is how do we treat institutions, period?
Well, I would disagree. I think there's two questions that need to be resolved. How can we address the institutions that we have here now, that are already here, and do we have the tools in place to address that? And then, how do we want to treat future churches? Two separate questions. So the zone change to allow for institutional uses in the B2 is answering the question, do we want institutional uses in the B2, and do we want more institutional uses in the B2? That's the question that is being asked with the zone change. And so again, I'm urging as a planner, saying let's separate these two. Let's not change the code to allow more institutional uses in order to solve the problem of how to address the existing ones. Let's ask those two separate questions. Let's not make a global change to fix existing situation that's going to create for future uses. So let's step back and take a comprehensive look and ask the question, do we want institutional uses everywhere? And what's the impact of that? Or do we merely just want to make sure that do we want to address our existing constituents, our existing property owners, existing churches, and take care of them and take care of that situation? Two separate questions.
Any other questions, comments on the zoning workshop? All right. If there are no further questions for Mr. Milan, thank you so much for your
Thank you.
presentation. Thanks for the great dialogue. I think I learned a lot today. Then the City Council will move to adjourn on Monday, February 4th at approximately 7:51.
The Zoning Commission will do the same.
Thank you. So we'll adjourn until our 8 o'clock meeting. Thank you.
I got it. Thank you, ma'am.